Bibles and turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 34. While you turn there, I'll get out the sermon notes so that I don't spend too much time meandering around and other thoughts as we try to take a look at this. And we are wrapping up today. We've come to the end of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the law, first 5 books of Scripture. We call them the Law, the Torah, or the Pentateuch. They're the 5 books that Moses wrote, although this chapter is one that we tend to think that either possibly Joshua wrote down at the end at the inspiration of God, or somebody else that was handling Moses' handwriting, because this is going to describe the death of Moses. And it's really, really hard to write after you're dead. Now there are some folks that would look at this and say, no, God inspired him. Moses was to write, hey Moses, this is what's about to happen, so write this down, and then you go and have it happen. But I don't think that's necessary. Some people think that if you take a chapter out of Moses' writing, that have somebody else write it, that it somehow will mess up the idea of Moses writing the Pentateuch. I don't think that's a problem. But anyway, that's what we've got. So this is our context. We are at the end of the wanderings in the wilderness. We have come out of the land of Egypt. Now, if you take the sweep of all, starting with Genesis, we've started with creation. And we've done Adam, Noah, Abraham. We've gone off into exile, not into exile, but into Egypt with a small group of people. We've come out of Egypt with a large group of people. We have covered, from the first of Genesis unto this point, somewhere around, and I'm not here to do math quickly, but somewhere, really almost 3,000 years, not quite, right? 2,500, about 2,500 years, because that's about the swoop of time that we have there. So we've covered a lot that's gone on from that point forward. Of course, most of that is covered in Genesis, and then starting with the book of Exodus, we've covered 40 years. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy gives you the law, the content thereof, and all the things that God commanded, and it all fits within the time frame of the Exodus coming up to the edge of the promised land of Kadesh Barnea, then having to be turned around and go back into the wilderness. Because when you tell the Lord God Almighty that you'd rather die in the desert than be obedient to what He's called you to do, He will answer that prayer and send you to die in the desert, which is what He did with the people of Israel, raised them up person for person. This is why you have, when you read this, and you read the book of Numbers, at the beginning you've got a census with these totals of how many people there are. And at the end, near the end of the book of Numbers, you have the same type of thing happening. This one from this family, this one from this family, this one from this family, on and on and on. And it's to show that the people of Israel lost no strength, that God didn't lose anybody in the wilderness. They didn't suffer any breakdown as a nation. He simply replaced them with the next generation. And so now we come to the end of the wanderings. They are pulled up on the east side of the Jordan River, waiting to go into the land at the time that is the land of the Canaanites, except that Moses has sinned earlier as he has dealt with the Israelites, and God has therefore commanded that he will not go into the promised land. And this was when he was told to speak to the rock, and instead he struck the rock, and God said, "You've not upheld my holiness, therefore you will not go in." So Moses now comes to the point in his life that he is about to die. And so God takes him up, and this is Deuteronomy 34, starting with verse 1. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab, we'll bleed through on the page there, of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the plain and the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor, and no one to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak, and his vitality had not left him. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. So we have here, I don't know if I put in a slide for this or not, 3 things happen that are important to keep up with. First of all, God keeps His word to Moses that he would be allowed to see the promised land. God takes him up on a mountain and shows him all of the promised land. Now, there's not really a great mountain that you can do this from apart from the supernatural intervention of God. Okay, even if your eye is not diminished. There's not a spot like Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga, Tennessee that you can see 7 states from. There's not really a spot like that overlooking Israel that you can see that whole distance. Because to get all the way to the Mediterranean would take a little bit of effort, and all the way north to south. So there are spaces that you can see, but I think part of this is that God allows him to see it, but he's just not allowed to cross in. But God fulfills that promise. Moses sees what he's worked for. He sees what he's put up with. He sees the land that the people are going to take. He's allowed to know that. And possibly as he's there, he thinks, well, I think that'll be a problem. That'd be a good place for this. This will be a good place for that. God allows him to see, and then he dies. And the reality is that is bearing down on every last one of us. Not to be a drunk on this nice rainy day, but physically speaking, because of Adam and Eve and the introduction of sin into the human race, we're all going to die someday. Whatever advances in medical science they come up with, they cannot stop death. You might think someday we'll come up with a cure for this disease, we'll come up with a cure for that disease, and I'm sure you will. But you notice that Moses, it says when he died that his vitality was not diminished, his eye was not dimmed. He was perfectly healthy. He could see just fine. He didn't even need bifocals, which is good because bifocals hadn't been invented yet. There was nothing wrong with Moses. It's not like he had to be carried up the mountain to be seen, to be there. In fact, he was, as far as you can tell, for somebody 120 years old, he was the picture of health. And yet still, he died. Why? Because it was his time, because God commanded it. God is the author of life, and it is in God's hands to remove it. And then the third thing happens that kind of strikes us as odd. Moses' grave is hidden. God hides where Moses is buried. He buries him somewhere in the valley. And to this day, I like how the author, the final compositor of Deuteronomy, probably an editor a few hundred years later, went down and made some notes. Hey, by the way, this even now we don't know where Moses was buried. Nobody knows. Fascinating sometimes how much effort and how much importance we attach to burial places, and yet the one that we worship the most, the Lord Jesus Christ, his burial place is empty. And so much of the rest of Scripture hinges on what Moses did, and we don't know where he's buried. We don't know where the Apostle Paul was buried. We don't know where, in fact, there are basically no certain tombs anywhere for any of the heroes of our faith, going back into Scripture. We don't know where the cave of Machpelah is that Abraham is buried in. We don't have that space. For all our monument building as a people, the folks that matter most in our faith, the best we've got is an empty tomb, which is a really good thing. Everybody else that died and stayed dead, we don't have. Moses' grave is hidden. God hides it for several, I think for several reasons. One of them being to prevent the Israelites from staying put too long. It says that they mourned for him 30 days, and then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid hands on him. So the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. No prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his officials, to all his land, and all the mighty acts of power and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Yet even so, he died. Why? Because the Lord keeps his word for the future. Up. Or not. Okay. There we go. Nope. The Lord keeps his word for the future. We ought to trust in the work of the Lord. The Lord gave Moses his word that he would die and that God would take the people of Israel on into the land. And in fact, that's what you get when you hit the book of Joshua. We'll turn the page and probably pick up on some moments there in the coming weeks. God gives the land to the people of Israel. He is their God, and he has been their God. He's dwelt in their midst. He's led them in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. He has been among them. He has judged their sin and met their needs. The Lord keeps his word for the future. We need to learn to trust in the work of the Lord when God gives something to be done, to go forward and to do it. So what do we do with that? First of all, wow, that put them all on one page. First of all, we're going to see that there are days of weeping. I really thought that was going to put them on separate slides, but that's okay. That there are days of weeping. There are things that go wrong. And the children of Israel had that. For them, Moses is dead, and these folks have grown up knowing Moses. For 40 years, he's been their leader. Not a lot has changed. Their life has been about the same for 38 to 40 years. What have they done? They've camped, they've lived in the space for a while. When the cloud rises up, they've loaded up at the sound of a trumpet, they've moved to the next spot, they've settled down. They've made this big loop from Kadesh Barnea all the way around. They've followed around in groups of 50, in groups of 50s and hundreds and thousands. Their complaints have gone up. The answers have come down. Their problems with each other have been solved through the systems that Moses has had. And always there's Moses with a staff and who goes in to meet with God face to face. When life changes, it's okay for there to be days of weeping. They are useful, because they allow us to mourn that which has passed and that which has changed, and also to celebrate the good that came of it. There's probably some folks that were 19 when the people of Israel got turned back into the wilderness, and now they're 59. And in all honesty, what they could do is they sit there by the edge of the promised land and go, that's really good, because if we'd have gone in, I'd have been in the army in about a year, and now I'm too old for it. So I get to stay here with the sheep while other people go. Others that are able to say, I remember this. I was 14 years old when we passed through the Red Sea, and I remember looking and seeing fish. I remember gathering. You see how that tabernacle over there is covered with aquatic animal hide? You go back into Exodus, it talks about, sea cow hides. You see that stuff? I was part of a group of people that was told, hey, as we pass through the Red Sea, gather this stuff up. Days of weeping are useful, but they also come to an end. It says that they mourned for Moses 30 days, and then the days of mourning for Moses came to an end. It doesn't mean the people forgot about Moses. What the last paragraph reminds us is that there was not a prophet like him ever again in the land of Israel. There was nobody. They spent a great deal of time looking for that prophet who would be like Moses. In fact, this is another one of those hints that throws forward the focus towards Jesus. Except that instead of Jesus seeing God face to face, Jesus is God. And so all those who saw him actually saw God face to face. It's the multiplication and spread of the blessing of the presence of God. In fact, the next time we see Moses, he's on a mountaintop with Jesus. And Peter the Baptist says, let's build something. What? It used to be that the standard offering envelope for every Southern Baptist church had a spot where when you put on how much you were going to give in the offering, there was a spot for general fund and a spot for building fund. It wasn't a blank, whatever designated or missions or this or that. It was just assumed that every Baptist church was trying to pay to build something. But Peter's a Baptist. Let's build something. Now we're not going to build anything. Okay, let's go fishing instead. He's a Baptist. Peter says, let's build tabernacles, shelters, something so that we can stay here. Jesus says, no. Because obedience is going forward. Just like in this time, as Moses' life comes to an end, and in that time, as it's time to follow Jesus, obedience is forward. It's not backwards and it's not static. It's not to, we'll just sit here and wait. Peter wanted to sit and wait and see what happened with the presence of Moses. The children of Israel, people of Israel could have chosen at this point to say, this is what we want to do. We're just going to sit here. Moses brought us this far and we don't think we can go any further. Because I've never seen Joshua do that whole stick, snake thing. I don't know if we can do this. And remember when we were back at Mount Sinai, it was Moses, Joshua and Moses went up, but Joshua only went about halfway up. Moses went the rest of the way up the mountain. Joshua hasn't talked to God face to face. I don't think we can follow him. Why don't we just stay here? There's plenty of space here. In fact, Ephraim, half the tribe of Manasseh, they're going to stay on this side of the river. Why don't we all just stay? It'll be all right. We've whooped these people. We don't have to go over there and whoop those people. Maybe later. But obedience is forward. Obedience is to walk forward to what God has said and to trust in the work of God, to trust in the Word of God and say, this is what I'm supposed to do. People of Israel were supposed to go forward. Alongside of that, we have to be cautious about setting places to dwell backward. It's very easy to do. Let's just stop and live here a while. We want to have a place that we can go back to, just in case it doesn't turn out right. This is what stymies us when it comes to telling our neighbors about Jesus. This is why unchurched people in America, and there are 200 million of them, 80% of them saying they'd go to church if they were invited by a friend. And of course, sometimes you may invite your friends and they say, actually, because you invited me, I'm going to go to the church that I grew up in this church, haven't been back in years. But instead of coming to church with you, since you brought it up, I'm going to go to my church. Sometimes it works that way, and that's an okay thing. But see, we want to make sure we've got places that we can dwell backwards just in case. Because it might get really, really awkward. If you go to invite your friend to come to church and they look at you and say, no. You're one of those churchy people. I don't want to talk to you anymore. It might get awkward. It might get more awkward if they come. What if they came to church? What if they come to church and the people in my Sunday school class like them better than they like me? We laugh. But I think we worry about that. What if they come to church and then they start to lead in a church? They get to be a part of this or a part of that, and then they're going to look at me sometimes in the way I act in the neighborhood, and they're going to ask how that lines up with the sermon I heard last week. Or worse, the sermon I preached last week. And so we want to set up those places of retreat that we can fall back to. So that we can dwell backwards. We can say, oh, it's okay, it didn't work. Let me come back to here, and so we don't ever step forward. and say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to follow after Jesus. I'm going to tell this person about Christ. We have this problem sometimes when we're high school students and college students or single people of any other, that's a really cute girl over there. I should tell her about Jesus, but she may not want to date me after I do that. Well, tell her anyway. God will worry about the rest of it. It's a really cute guy over there. I'm just intimidated by cute guys. I know some of you girls are that way. Just intimidated by them. Well, that's fine. Don't let your intimidation send them to hell. Meanwhile, some of you need to get over the fact thinking that you're so cute that people should be coming up to you and talking to you, and you need to go out and talk to them. Be cautious about setting places to dwell backwards. We need to be the same way as a church, willing to go forward and say, this is what God has, this is where we are. This is where the world around us is. This is how we can reach out into that world to tell people about Jesus. We say, oh, but it was so much better back then. Let me go ahead and give you a very honest, personal statement on that. I really liked church back then. I really liked it in the late 80s when we went to First Baptist Church of Ruston, Louisiana. We sang nothing but hymns. Our music minister was the professor of music for Louisiana Tech University. I tease Carla sometimes about how we need to break out the Hallelujah chorus at Christmas and all that. I grew up with that. I grew up with coats and ties in church on Sunday morning and Sunday night. And that was just what you did. Choir robes, everything, all of the, as you brought the offering back forward, you didn't just stick it over here on the side. Everybody stood. The ushers went to the back. They went from the front to back, and then everybody stood. We sang the doxology as they brought. I looked it up. We were talking about it in one of the Sunday school classes this morning. It was First Ruston. I got a hold of Dad before he started church to find out which church it was. We all stood and sang the doxology as they brought the offering forward and put it on the remembrance table. Some of y'all don't even know what a doxology is. But it's a song that we used to have, remember, and everybody got real formal, and you had 5 parts worth of harmony going on. You had first and second sopranos, and altos, and tenors, and basses. And you had this big thing that made a lot of noise, and had a lot of pipes attached to it. It's called an organ. I really liked that. It was comfortable, it's what I was used to. You couldn't help but have a sense of the awe and the majesty of God, because it was big and it was formal and it was proper. And I do miss some of the songs. That's why when Carl and I sit down to play, we put songs like Holy, Holy, Holy in there that some of y'all look blankly at because you're like, I sung that in 20 years. Good stuff. Actually, we sang it last Sunday night. See, you just need to come on Sunday nights. Some stuff happens on Sunday nights. It doesn't happen on Sunday mornings. But in the process of all of that formality and all of that making sure that we had an awe for the reverence of God, the thing that a lot of people ended up losing touch with is the fact that the God who is so majestic and rules over the universe is also the God who is very, very personal. He's not just God off in the distance, but He is our Father. It's what we talked about last week, that we're adopted as His children, we're adopted as His sons and as His daughters. And so yes, our worship should have a majesticness to it because He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But He is also our Father. And in the intervening time, in the last 30 years, there have been times that, in all honesty, I put on a suit and tie to go to work every day. And I hated to put one on to go to church on Sunday. I was a funeral director. I put on a suit and tie every day to deal with death. It's also what flowers make me think of after a year and a half in the funeral business. And so while on the one hand, 30 years ago, the bright, fresh flowers every Sunday in church and different flowers, y'all churches spending thousands upon thousands of flowers. I'm serious. You look at some of those budgets back in those days. There's a lot of comfort looking backward. But obedience requires us to go forward. I miss some of those things too. And I love some of those things. I don't love choir robes. Y'all got to understand, it is 10 degrees hotter up here at minimum from what it is down there, if not worse. And then you put on, a choir robe on top of it. There are several reasons of theology that I'm not Presbyterian, but a very practical reason is this: most of their preachers wear robes when they preach. No. Obedience involves going forward, not abandoning the things of value from the past, not abandoning the memories that matter, not abandoning the work that God has done in the ways that we have followed Him in the past, and not abandoning what He has commanded that we keep doing. But absolutely, we have to look ahead to say, what do we do now? Whether it's in how we organize the worship service as we come together, whether it's in what style of music that we do, the addition of drums, the subtraction of this, the addition of a harmonica. There's pastors that I grew up with that would just roll up and croak at the idea of adding drums and harmonica to Holy, Holy, Holy. They'd cover their ears and run out the back door screaming. And these are not men that ran. A lot of pastors don't run. You can tell by looking at us. Be cautious about setting places to dwell backward, because the goal of our existence as a church is not that we would preserve any specific moment in time, but that we would carry the light of the gospel to the world around us. See, that's why obedience is forward. There's value in the remembering, but in not being addicted to the past. And this is always a tough spot for me. I am a historian. This is what I do, is I study the past. I love the past. But we can't be addicted to it and constantly wanting to live in it and to dwell in it. Instead, we have to say, what can we gather from the past that is valuable going ahead? What can we learn from the past that helps us as people to better understand who our God is? What Jesus has done for us? But our obedience requires us that we take that past and say, this is the foundation that we can stand on. Now we go forward, following after God. Why do we do that? Because it is God's call on our lives as His people that we would walk with Jesus and we take as many people with us as we can. Not into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, as much as it's fun. Not into the Baroque Music Hall of Fame, which is also fun. Some of you don't think that one's fun, but it is. Not that we would take as many people with us as we can back to the 80s, back to the 50s, or ahead into the 2020 and beyond with this music, that music, or off into this or the other, but rather that we walk with Jesus wherever it is that He has us to go. Because it is not that He has for us to continue to dwell on the far side of the Jordan out of His presence, out of fulfillment of His promise, but it is that He would have us to walk with Him as we go and seek out those who need Him. Those who have no assurance that their eternity is fixed with Him and have no presence of Him in their hearts now as they deal with the things that they face today. Those who need to know that God loved them so much, not that God put out some signposts and hoped that they would find Him, but that God came looking for them. Wednesday night classes, we've been dealing with Revelation, the story this past week. The guy told, that's the preacher on the video. Still getting used to using videos. That's weird. It's good. I'm getting to learn some things in the process. Good to hear from somebody other than me. We talked about a time he was having a dinner party at his house and about the fact that there were people who got lost. They couldn't quite follow the directions to get there. So what he did is just, you stay where you are. I want to drive out and find you and bring you back. He said, that's a picture of what God did for us. Some folks are close. They can pick up and follow the directions, and they can get close, but they don't get all the way. But there are other people that end up far, far away. You still have to go out and find them. Every one of us, no matter how close we were to God, the bulk of the work had to be done by Him, coming to find us and bring us to Him. Jesus came and found us, went to the cross for us, and brought us back. Now God sends us to go to the world to tell them about Him. Because, some people will eventually blunder their way into a church. They'll stumble their way across a Bible. They'll be one of 100,000 people to get a Bible, and they'll actually pick it up and read it. They'll be one of the 5% of people that a pastor will come across that, in his efforts to invite or to engage or to work in the community to bring somebody to church. But you know what tends to happen with that? It takes long enough for that person to become friends with that church leader for them to respond so that they fit into his 80% or her 80%. But most folks are going to respond. They'll follow Jesus. They'll walk with Jesus if we say, come with me. Because if you're not gone home to your eternal reward yet, there's still something for you to do. There's still a purpose that God has for you here. And it's not just to be an observer. It's not to be a critic. It's not to be someone to point out all the ways that the rest of us do it wrong. It's not even to be simply a cheerleader, although we need those too. You don't have to have pom-poms for that. You just need to be an encourager. But it is to pick up and to look around you and see these are the ways that I can help. So will we live forward today and walk in obedience? Or will we build a monument to dwell in a place that God intended for us to move on from all? Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love, your grace, and your mercy. Pray, Lord, that you'll help us to follow you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As we come to the time of our service that we call our time of invitation, it means this: we invite you to respond. Scott and Carla are going to come and lead us as we sing I Surrender All. I'll be standing at the front. You may wonder why I'm there. In case you want to ask what it is,